Strawberry's Wake. Dance, Gavin, Dance. Chapter 1. Gabe. I slid out from beneath Harper's sleeping form and padded quietly out of the bedroom and down the hall. A week had passed since she left the hospital, and she hadn't left the penthouse once. That was partly my fault. Every time I thought about her being out there, in public, it sent me into a panic attack. What if Meredith wasn't the only stalker? What if another one turned up? What if someone else grabbed her? What if we didn't find her this time? None of it showed on my face or in my behavior when she mentioned going out. I simply distracted her. I'd drag her to my studio, play songs and sing to her, or suggest a movie and order food. She didn't put up much of an argument. I think, deep down, she wasn't ready to leave either. She was thinner than she should be, and she tired easily, often taking a nap during the day. The bruising on her face had gone, but I still saw it every time I looked at her. I saw the bruises, the chapped lips, the dark circles beneath her eyes. I saw it all, heard her screaming every time I closed my eyes. I couldn't look at her without guilt overwhelming me. The knowledge that she'd suffered far more since I came back into her life than she had without me there. I tried to leave, to walk away and let her find a better future. But she wouldn't let me, and I was too fucking weak to fight her. But I was losing her. I could see it in her eyes every time she looked at me. And that was my fault, too. I grabbed a beer from the refrigerator and headed outside onto the private balcony, which ran around two sides of the floor the penthouse was on. Dropping heavily onto one of the recliners, I twisted the cap off the beer and took a long swallow. The things I didn't do to keep her with me? I ticked each one off on my fingers. I didn't touch her. I didn't kiss her. I didn't hold her. I couldn't. I was terrified of hurting her, of bruising her already damaged body more than it was. And so we lived in this strange limbo, where we both acted like nothing was wrong, and she watched me out of eyes that cooled more with every passing day as she built up walls to protect herself. I tipped my head back against the headrest and closed my eyes. I couldn't remember when I last slept. 2 days? 3? I went through the motions, crawling into bed and staring at the ceiling until Harper rolled against me in her sleep. At that point, I vacated the bedroom, unwilling to stay in case her touch tempted me to dive back into her sweetness, because I knew that once I had the taste of her on my tongue again, I wouldn't stop.
Gabe?
Her voice broke the silence of the pre-dawn hour, and I opened my eyes to watch her move toward me. For a second, her figure was overlaid with that of how I'd found her almost 2 weeks ago, and I shook my head to dispel the image.
Can we talk?
My eyes snapped back to her as she settled on the edge of the lounger and twisted so she could face me.
I'm thinking I should go and stay with Shaban.
Why? My voice was harsher than I intended, and she bit her lip. I'm sorry. I gentled my tone and took another swallow of beer. If that's what you need to do, then yeah, you should do it. And that was the moment I realized I'd walked into a trap. Her spine stiffened and her eyes narrowed, flashing fire at me. She shot upright, snatched the bottle from my hand, and threw it across the balcony. It hit the privacy wall with a crash. I watched the liquid drip down the wall for a second and then redirected my gaze to Harper.
Do you really think I can't see what you're doing?
She demanded. It's not rocket science, Frosty. I'm sitting out here enjoying the quiet and having a beer. I glanced over at the broken bottle. Was having a beer, I amended. She shook her head.
Are you telling me you're perfectly happy with me leaving?
I'm telling you that if you want to leave, I'm not standing in your way.
And you'll be happy about it?
Didn't say that. She punched my shoulder.
You didn't not say it either.
What do you want me to say? I rose to my feet, dodged the second swing of her fist, and put the lounger between us. "Stop trying to hit me."
Stop acting like I'm going to break if you breathe too heavily near me. Answer me, Gabriel. Do you want me to move back in with Shaban?
"No, I fucking don't."
Then what do you want?
"I want to go back in time to the fucking gig and not have Miles kidnap you." I didn't realize I was shouting until I stopped and heard the words echo back at me.
You think I don't? Do you think I'm okay with what happened? Do you think I like looking and feeling like this?
She waved her hand down the front of herself.
Do you think I enjoy knowing you don't want me anymore?
Her voice broke on the final word, and I watched her as her confidence crumpled, tears welling in her eyes. Fuck. I reached for her, all resolve not to touch her, gone, wrapped one arm around her waist to haul her against me and cupped the back of her head with my other hand to press her face to my shoulder. "I want you so much, it hurts, Frosty. There's never been a moment when I haven't wanted you." I whispered into her hair. "I just don't want to hurt you anymore."
Strawberry, Everclear. Chapter 2. Harper. I buried my face into the material of his shirt and breathed in his scent. I knew what he'd been doing for the past week, but I also knew Gabe. And until he admitted to himself that something was bothering him, there was no way I could have gotten through to him. I let myself lean against him and felt his arm tighten around me. When did you last sleep? He'd had trouble sleeping for as long as I'd known him. He would go days avoiding sleep if his dad was at home and drinking, so he wasn't taken unawares. I guess some habits were hard to break. Come back to bed. It's still early. He let me unwrap his arm and pull him back inside. We returned to the bedroom in silence and I climbed onto the mattress. I thought for a second he was going to refuse and leave, but after a long moment, he joined me on the bed, settling back against the pillows and staring up at the ceiling. I slid onto my side, propped my head up on one hand, and stared at him. His eyes were staring directly upwards, and I knew he was doing his damnedest to ignore my presence so he could wallow in self-recrimination and misplaced guilt. Well, I wasn't going to let that continue. Pulling on my metaphorical big girl pants, I reached across him and caught his hand in mine. Interlinking our fingers, I scooted closer and rested my head against his shoulder. When we were kids, I was terrified that one day I'd wake up and discover your dad had killed you, or put you into the hospital and I'd never see you again. I tugged our linked hands closer. When Miles took me, I felt his body tense. I don't remember a lot of it. I remember waking up somewhere cold. I'd already told all this to the police when I was still in the hospital, but Gabe hadn't been there to listen. Other than that, I was mostly out of it. But when I was conscious, I was so scared he'd killed you, that he'd left you dead in the car.
"Harper,"
he began, and I shook my head. "Let me talk, Gabe." I lifted my head to press a kiss to his jaw. When I finally woke up in that bathroom,
"The house in Malibu.
a muscle ticked in his jaw.
I'm putting it on the market."
Releasing his hand, I lifted mine and cupped his jaw to turn his head toward me. When we talked about how the whole kidnap was to send you a message, I was relieved. You were alive, and I knew if I could keep him talking, stall him, then you would find me. I knew you would find me, Gabe.
"You couldn't know that."
Do you remember when our apartment block caught fire? I could see the confusion at my question in his eyes, but he gave a slow nod. You told me that night wasn't our time to die, that we still had too much to do. And in that bathroom, while Miles told me what he was going to do and why, I could hear your voice whispering in my head, telling me to hold on. It wasn't my time to die that night. I was reaching him. I could see it in those expressive gray eyes. They were darkening with every word I uttered, the tension in his body easing. You always save me, Gabe. It's who you are. I gave him a smile, then cuddled into his side. He didn't speak immediately, and I knew he was thinking about my words. So I waited quietly, tracing patterns on his shirt with one finger. When his chest moved with the deep breath he sucked in, I knew he'd come to a decision. I felt his hand caress down my spine, and then he kissed the top of my head.
You're one of a kind, Harper. I'm going to sleep now. But later, when we're both awake, we're going to figure this shit out.
I smiled to myself. Disaster averted.
Strawberry Swing, Coldplay, Chapter 3, Gabe. I returned to consciousness with a jolt, the tail edges of a dream startling me into opening my eyes. Harper was a warm presence beside me, and for the first time since she'd gone missing, I felt myself relax. She was right. I needed to move forward. She was alive, safe. And it was time I stopped obsessively focusing on what might have happened and looked forward to what I wanted to happen. I reached out with one arm and groped around until I felt my fingers touch my cell. Carefully, not wanting to disturb Harper, I shifted toward the edge of the bed and picked it up. It was time I made things right, and that meant making a plan. I eased the rest of the way out from beneath Harper's sleeping form and retraced my earlier steps out onto the balcony. Only this time, I wasn't dragging a shit ton of self-guilt with me. I tapped around on my cell's screen, fired off a couple of texts, replied to one from Seth asking if I was ready to reschedule the gig at Roth's, telling him in, I thought, succinct terms to fuck off. My response triggered an equally offensive reply, and we bantered back and forth for a few minutes while I checked my emails. Replied to Candace's ever-increasing demands for proof of life, and then tossed my cell on the lounger and went back inside and searched for food. Predictably, Harper appeared in the archway just as I was sliding a grilled cheese sandwich onto a plate. I pushed it across the counter with a smile. I knew the smell would wake you. I'd purposely gone with something I knew she loved because I needed her to eat more. Omelets and grilled cheese were two of our staple meals growing up. Quick, easy to prepare with limited food supplies, and filling enough to get us through the day when money was tight and the cupboards bare. Money was no longer an issue for me, and my kitchen was always overflowing with food, yet I often went back to the basics. There was something comforting about it. I watched Harper as she tucked into it with relish, not even waiting to sit down before taking a bite. And then she let loose a throaty moan that made my dick twitch. Well, hello. Welcome back, libido. It's just grilled cheese, Frosty. I laughed. She chewed, swallowed, and pointed a finger at me.
But it's a Gabe Mercer's special, and I haven't had one of those in...
She trailed off when I laughed harder.
What's so funny?
If it's a Gabe Mercer special you're after. I drawled the words out slowly, hiking an eyebrow as I leered at her, and her cheeks fired up.
I didn't mean... I meant...
She sputtered, then huffed and shook her head.
I should have known better than to try to compliment you.
You can compliment me all day long, baby. But I should at least do something worth those sexy moans. I glanced over at the wall clock. Actually, I have an idea. Why don't we get out of here for an hour?
Out?
I could hear the nerves in her voice and blame myself for it. If I'd pushed for her to go out whenever she'd mentioned it, instead of keeping her locked inside, she wouldn't be worried. We've been cooped up in here all week. I think it's time we face the outside world again. Finish your orgasm toasty, shower, and we'll get moving.
Orgasm toasty?
She laughed. I shrugged. I only hear those moans coming out of your mouth during sex. You're clearly getting off on that cheese. I threw her a wink, and she rolled her eyes at me.
I meant, why are you calling it a toasty?
Oh, that's what they call it in England. I met up with DJ and Sean over there a few years ago, and we hung out in this freaky little town. The diner did these cheese toasty things, and we were curious. Turns out it's basically grilled cheese, but orgasmic grilled cheese doesn't have quite the same ring as an orgasm toasty. Don't you agree?
I think you have a serious food fetish and need help.
You're right. I do need help. And we'll work on that. But first, finish your lunch.
Strawberries and Cigarettes. Troye Sivan. Chapter 4. Harper. Gabe was waiting for me in the main living room after I'd showered and dressed. My stomach churned at the thought of leaving the penthouse. It would be the first time since I'd traveled from the hospital, full of determination and anger with Gabe for walking away from me again. I had focused on making him see he was making the wrong decision and had no time to worry about anything else. This time was different. I knew Gabe was worried. That was why I hadn't pushed too hard when he didn't want to go out any time I suggested it. But I was worried too. It was stepping out into the unknown. The newspapers had been full of photographs, articles digging into both our histories, trying to piece together the full story of what had happened. Jefferson Thomas, the reporter from the LA Inquisitor, had printed the interview I'd done with him, focusing on the story I'd told him and not the one that had led me to being in a hospital bed. That had made other reporters and news outlets hungry for more. In the penthouse, we were safe. No one could get inside without a key or an invitation. But now, Gabe wanted us to leave that safety and let the world back into our lives. "Where are we going?" I asked, watching as he idly toyed with his lighter and watched the numbers above the elevator rising to indicate its approach to our floor.
Remy's waiting with a car downstairs.
He pocketed his lighter and held out a hand just as the doors slid open. The action threw me back to the first time I'd stood in front of his elevator, about to spend time with him for the first time in 8 years. It was hard to believe it had only been a few short months since that day. So much had happened.
Frosty?
His quiet query caused me to lift my eyes from his hand to his face.
You okay?
I nodded and smiled. "I'm okay," I told him, took his hand and followed him inside the elevator. He turned to face me as the doors closed, sealing us inside, and brushed his knuckles down my cheek.
I'm sorry.
My brows pulled together. For what?
For being selfish. For being distant. For not being what you needed this past week.
He tugged me closer and bent to press his forehead against mine.
I've been so focused on my own fears that I wasn't there to help you with yours.
I reached up and looped my arms around his neck, stepping into his body. His arms wound around my waist and I felt his chest move against mine as he took in a breath.
You're too good for me, Harper. I'm scared that you'll wake up one day and realize that.
Well, you're perfect for me. It's not my fault it's taken you so long to figure that out. I knew from the first moment we met.
Did you now?
Warm amusement threaded through his voice.
I'm pretty sure I told you I loved you from the moment I met you. That doesn't mean I deserve you.
Yes, well, it's too late. You let me in. Now, I'm never leaving. That got the chuckle I was aiming for.
What if I changed the locks?
His lips trailed across my cheek. I'd set up camp in the elevator. Did you know Yoko Ono camped out in John Lennon's garden when he was still married to Cynthia? I'd totally go there.
I don't have a garden.
His mouth was on my throat, pressing hot kisses to the pulse beating at the base, which is why I said the elevator.
I could change the key requirements.
Seth would give me his key. I'd tip my head sideways when his tongue ran up the column of my throat and along my jaw.
No, I wouldn't.
He likes me more than you, I argued.
He'd have my babies if I asked him.
Gabe lifted his head, his mouth hovering above mine. So would I told him, and closed the distance between us so I could kiss him.
Strawberry Avalanche, Owl City. Chapter 5. Gabe. The ding and swish of the doors was the only warning I got, and I pulled my mouth from Harper's seconds before they opened onto the underground parking lot. A flash of lights told me where Remy was parked, and taking Harper's hand in mine, we walked over. Remy was out of the car with the door open by the time we reached him, and I stepped back to allow Harper inside first, then climbed in beside her. Remy strode back to the front and fired the engine.
You didn't say where we were going,
Harper said, the question clear in her voice. You're right. I didn't. It's a surprise. I draped my arm across her shoulders and pulled her closer. It's not far and it shouldn't be too busy. I leaned forward so I could reach a hand into the back of my jeans. That reminds me. Put this on. I handed her a Club Damnation ball cap. She held it in her hands and frowned at me. Your face is almost as recognizable as mine now. The cap helps, I explained, taking it back and placing it on her head. I sat back to survey the result. It suits you.
And I need a rock star disguise because...
I grinned, settling my own cap into place. Because you're famous now, Frosty? The car glided to a stop and I glanced out the window. We're here.
And just where is...
She trailed off, and I knew she'd seen the sign.
Molly's,
she whispered, turning to me with wide eyes. Best ice cream on the block, Harper. The privacy glass slid down and Remy twisted in his seat.
I'll go inside first. Give me a couple of minutes. If I don't come back out, it's not too busy, you can come in.
He waited for my nod and then exited the car.
How did you know it was still here?
Harper asked. The power of Google. I waved my cell at her. When was the last time you came? Her lip curled at my question, and I snorted. Who's the one with a dirty mind now? Let me rephrase. When did you last visit?
With you, for my 18th. You and Seth brought me before you went off on your first big countrywide tour.
I remember. You didn't come back?
No. With the way my mom was, I didn't have a lot of free time, and then...
She shrugged.
Well, when I saw you again and you...
When I fucked you and threw you out? I didn't sugarcoat what I'd done to her. We were beyond excuses for the way I'd treated her back then.
Don't say it like that,
she chided me.
But yeah, I wanted to keep the memory happy. Coming back would have ruined it. I was too angry with you.
Well, let's go and make another happy memory. I think enough time has passed. I opened the door and stepped out, then held out my hand for Harper. Instead of holding it, though, I took it and wrapped her arm around mine, patted her hand when it rested on my forearm, and then led the way inside a diner we hadn't been near for over 8 years. I heard Harper's sharp intake of breath as the doors swung shut behind us, and I knew why. It was like taking a step back into the past. Nothing had changed. I scanned the interior, eyes darting from the faded red vinyl bench seats to the terrible painting of an ice cream sundae on the far wall. The smells and sounds took me back to the rare occasions we had enough money to split dinner and dessert. We'd always take the booth right at the back, away from everyone, and bicker over our plate. Harper leaned against my side, rising up on her toes. I canted my head slightly so she could whisper in my ear.
It's exactly the same,
she breathed. Yeah. My voice broke on the word and I cleared my throat. Come on, let's go see if our seat is taken. I spotted Remy on one of the stools at the counter and he gave me a small nod as we passed.
Hey, look, our seat is empty.
Harper nodded toward the corner seat, partially hidden by a flowery partition and some green plant with big leaves I didn't recognize. We took our usual seats opposite each other and Harper reached out to pick up the menu. For a brief second, I saw her 18-year-old self. Hair still lavender, but shorter. She was wearing an Aerosmith t-shirt, mine as always, and faded, ripped blue jeans. On her feet she would be wearing an old pair of silver-gray Vans with laces that had become unthreaded. She'd found them in a Goodwill store, and between us we'd had enough cash to buy them. I smiled at the memory. "Want to split a dessert?" I asked, plucking the menu from her fingers. "For old time's sake?" Before she could answer, the server approached us. "What can I get you guys?" I smiled at Harper. "What's your daily special on desserts?"
Our homemade strawberry ice cream. It comes loaded with marshmallows, fresh strawberries, and optional strawberry sauce.
She sing-songed. My smile turned wicked and Harper's cheeks turned a brilliant shade of red. "Perfect," I purred. 1 large bowl, 2 spoons.
Strawberry Fields Forever. The Beatles. Chapter 6. Harper. The moment the server said strawberries, and Gabe's lips tilted upwards, I felt my cheeks heat up. There were 2 reasons for that. The first was what he'd done with strawberries a few weeks back, what I'd let him do. The second was the fact I'd brought strawberries with me when I chased him from the hospital to his penthouse in a bid to force him to give our relationship another chance. Obviously, I didn't believe the strawberries would make that happen, but I'd hoped the humor behind it would give me the opening I needed. When he ordered strawberries in a voice rich with innuendo and amusement, I sank my teeth into my bottom lip to stop myself blurting out words that would make it obvious to the server where my thoughts had gone. "Why are you so obsessed with strawberries?" I asked him once she'd taken his order and left. He studied me from across the table, smiling.
"Do you remember what we did for your 15th birthday?"
He said instead of answering my question. I thought about it for a second. We came here. The same thing we did every year. With Deacon and Sean, I think.
"That's right."
He leaned his elbows on the tabletop and rested his chin on his linked fingers.
"Do you remember what we ate?"
I frowned, thinking about it. We always got whatever the daily special was.
The daily special that day was their chicken pot pie and...
He paused to lick his lips.
Their strawberry ice cream special. You went nuts over it. Deacon teased you about having a strawberry fetish for days.
I opened my mouth to argue, then stopped as the memory flared. He was right. I'd forgotten all about that, lost it in the memories of what had happened later that night. The fire, almost dying, the desperate climb down a fire escape that had seen better days.
You savored those fucking strawberries like they were your last meal. I was sitting opposite you, right here, in fact.
He unlaced his fingers to tap the table.
I couldn't move, could barely fucking breathe. And that was the moment I realized that not only did I love you, but I was in so much fucking trouble. You were 15, I was 17. No prospects, nothing to offer you. And I was sitting there with a hard-on that threatened to burst out of my jeans, wedged in the corner next to 2 of my best friends, terrified one of them would look down and see.
I remember we had to wait outside for you. You said you'd drop something and would catch up to us, I said slowly. Gabe nodded.
Yeah. There was no way I could get up from the table until I got control of myself.
He reached across the table to brush his knuckles down my cheek.
Thing is, Frosty, that was the day I knew if I didn't put some distance between us, you'd end up in my bed and I'd totally fuck things up.
You don't know that. He always insisted that if we'd got together when we were younger, it wouldn't have worked, but I didn't agree.
I do. I know you think we could have made it work and lived happily ever after, but I wanted more for you. For us.
He waved a hand.
Let's not rehash it. I made choices looking back that weren't healthy, but I can't change the past.
The server returned with our order then, and he leaned back in his seat, watching while she placed the bowls on the table. One was filled with ice cream, another with strawberries. She set a pot of red strawberry sauce down to one side, and beside it, another filled with whipped cream. "Enjoy," she chirped and bounced away.
So the reason for my fascination with strawberries, Frosty?
Gabe picked up the conversation again.
Is you. I kissed you at the door when we got home at the end of the day. Do you remember?
I did. Usually whenever Gabe kissed me when we were kids, it was on the forehead or cheek. But that day he'd kissed my mouth. I thought he'd misjudged and said nothing about it, but at the same time, I'd wondered if I imagined the way his lips had lingered against mine.
You tasted of strawberries and ice cream. From that day, every single time I saw strawberries, I was reminded of you, of that day.
He plucked a strawberry from the bowl and swirled it around in the soft ice cream, then held it to my lips.
Harper and strawberries.
His tongue slicked over his bottom lip as I held his gaze and took a bite from the red fruit he held between his fingers.
The perfect combination,
he whispered.
Strawberry Lipstick, Youngblood. Chapter 7. Gabe. We fed each other the strawberries, while I tormented myself watching her tongue sweep out to lick at the ice cream before her teeth sank into the fruit. At some point, I switched seats, moving around the table and slid in beside her, needing to be closer. And the slow torture continued until the bowls were empty and our fingers were sticky with ice cream and juice from the strawberries.
"We should go home,"
she whispered. We should, I agreed, resisting the urge to taste her lips, knowing if I did, the customers would get a show they hadn't signed up for. Let's go. I stood, threw money down onto the table, and grabbed her hand.
"Wait."
She pulled away and veered toward the counter, where she held a hurried conversation with the woman standing there. I stood near the door, head tipped down to hide my face, and waited impatiently. On the periphery of my vision, I saw Remy move past me and knew he'd be waiting outside with the car. A few minutes later, Harper was beside me and I held the door open for her so we could leave. I wasn't even settled onto the back seat before Harper was crawling onto my lap and searching out my mouth. I didn't complain, not even when she bit into my lip and the coppery taste of blood hit my tongue. I loved all aspects of the woman tearing off my clothes. The sweet, quiet one who blushed at my outrageous words and actions, the confident one who called me out on my shit. And this one, the one that was so hot and horny that the mere fact we were in the back seat of a car on a busy street was not getting in the way of her taking what she wanted. I let her have control, take the lead, content to enjoy her mouth on mine and the feel of her hands sliding over my ribs beneath my shirt. I could taste the strawberries and ice cream on her tongue, and I groaned into her mouth. What were you doing? I asked her when she separated her mouth from mine long enough to drag my t-shirt over my head.
"When?"
Back at the diner. She lifted her head from where she was kissing along my shoulder, and I swear I could only describe her smile as devilish. Her fingers ran down my chest and over my abs.
"I bought a bottle of their strawberry sauce."
As she spoke, she slid off the edge of the seat between my legs and popped the buttons on my jeans. What are you planning to do with that? The look in her eyes made me harder than I already was. There was a promise there, a hint of mischief, and a whole lot of arousal. The engine cut out and Remy rapped on the glass separating us before letting it slide down an inch.
"We're here. Don't get my interior sticky. Get your asses back upstairs."
He let the divider close before either of us could respond. I threw open the car door. What do you say, Frosty? Want to get sticky with me? She followed me out, wrapping her arm around my waist.
I thought you'd never ask.
I called the elevator and the doors slid open immediately. The second we were inside, she was in my arms again. Her lips seared a path down my throat, along my collarbone and down. She flicked at my nipple piercing with her tongue, but didn't stop moving until she was on her knees, and her fingers were tugging the denim down my legs. When those same fingers wrapped around my erection, the pleasure was pure and explosive. My head tipped back against the wall and I closed my eyes, drowning in the sensation of her stroking me. Fuck. Harper. My voice was a choked plea when I felt her warm breath against my thigh moments before she poured something warm over my dick. My eyes popped open and I looked down to find a small bottle in her hand, filled with something red. The smell of strawberries reached me just as her tongue came out and licked it up. Shit. Fuck. My fingers found the top of her head, tangled into her hair as I fought to stop myself from coming like a teenager, getting his first blowjob. Her mouth opened and sucked me in, and I wasn't convinced I was going to be able to stop myself. I'd never been so thankful to hear the swish of the elevator doors opening. Carefully, easing myself out of Harper's mouth, I tugged her to her feet, kicked my legs the rest of the way out of the jeans pooling around my ankles, and left them in the elevator. We practically fell through the door of my penthouse in my hurry to pull her clothes off. When I cursed beneath my breath, she laughed. What's so funny?
Role reversal. This time you're naked and I'm fully clothed.
She gave me a gentle pushback and peeled her t-shirt off. Not for long, I promised. Give me that bottle. I held out my hand. Her grin was impish when she passed it to me. I took it, then grabbed her by the waist and slung her over my shoulder. She shrieked, part scream, part laughter, as I carried her through to the bedroom and tossed her onto the bed. Throwing the bottle to one side, I came down above her, pushing one leg between her thighs and capturing her mouth with mine. Her lips parted for my tongue, welcomed my invasion, even while she mounted her own, and we fought for dominance. Tongues dueling, teeth nipping, mouths locked together. My hand worked at her jeans, unzipping and pushing them down over her thighs and legs until she could kick them off. And then time seemed to stop. I held myself above her, looked down into her eyes, felt myself fall into those unique purple irises, and she lifted her hands to curve them over my jaw. The passion and heat were there. I could see it in her eyes, but a soft smile played about her lips as she gazed up at me.
I missed you,
she whispered. I'm sorry it took me so long, I told her. I didn't need to explain. She knew I didn't mean the 8 years we'd been apart, but the past week, while I'd been so distant. I lowered myself down onto her slowly, savoring the way her legs lifted and wrapped around my hips, the way her breath left her lips on a gentle sigh, and I eased into her, and the way she whispered my name like a prayer as I drove her to the heights of ecstasy. As her orgasm hit, I caught her chin and tipped her head up so I could meet her gaze. Happy Strawberry Ice Cream Day, Frosty.
Drop